You think you know when someone dislikes you. You think it's obvious. But what if I told you that the people closest to you, your friends, your family, your colleagues, might already hate you, and you have absolutely no idea? What if the signs have been there all along, hidden in plain sight, and you've been completely blind to them? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll never look at human behavior the same way again. And more importantly, you'll discover the 7 psychological triggers that turn even your biggest supporters into secret enemies, triggers that Carl Jung spent decades uncovering in his revolutionary work on the human psyche. Carl Jung discovered something disturbing about human nature that most people refuse to accept. He found that beneath our conscious minds lies what he called the shadow, the dark, hidden parts of ourselves that we refuse to acknowledge. But here's what Jung didn't fully explore in his early work. How our shadows create invisible hatred toward others, and how this hatred operates like a psychological virus, spreading through relationships without anyone ever realizing they're infected. According to Carl Jung, we don't just repress our own darkness, we project it onto the people around us with surgical precision. And when this happens, something sinister begins to unfold in the unconscious theater of human relationships. Jung spent over 40 years studying patients who came to him confused about why their relationships were falling apart. They couldn't understand why people who once loved them had turned cold, distant, or hostile. What Jung discovered through thousands of hours of analysis was that most human hatred isn't born from obvious conflicts, it's born from unconscious psychological processes that operate below the threshold of awareness. But before I reveal the 7 triggers, let me ask you this. Have you ever noticed how someone's energy toward you changed, but they never said anything directly? Maybe they started taking longer to respond to your messages. Maybe their hugs felt different. Maybe they stopped making eye contact the same way. Keep that feeling in mind, because we're about to uncover exactly what happened in their unconscious mind. The truth is, most people will never tell you they've started to resent you. Why? Because they don't even realize it themselves. Carl Jung called this phenomenon unconscious compensation, the mind's ability to hide its true feelings not just from others, but from itself. The human psyche is incredibly skilled at creating elaborate justifications for feelings it doesn't want to acknowledge. Carl Jung said that envy is one of the most destructive forces in human relationships, yet it's also the most hidden. When you succeed, whether it's getting a promotion, finding love, losing weight, starting a business, or even just appearing genuinely happy, something dark awakens in the people around you, something Jung called the envious shadow. Here's what happens in their unconscious mind. According to Jung's research, your success becomes a mirror reflecting their failures, their unrealized potential, their abandoned dreams. And instead of celebrating you, their shadow begins to whisper poisonous thoughts. They don't deserve this. They got lucky. They think they're better than us now. Jung discovered that this process happens automatically and unconsciously. The person experiencing envy doesn't wake up one day and decide to hate you. Instead, their psyche begins a slow, methodical process of devaluation. They start noticing flaws in you they never saw before. They begin questioning your motives. They start finding reasons why your success isn't real or isn't earned. But here's the twisted part. And this is where it gets really psychological, they'll actually become more friendly to your face. Jung discovered this phenomenon in his patients repeatedly. The bigger the unconscious resentment, the more exaggerated the conscious politeness becomes. This is what Jung called reaction formation, when the unconscious mind is so threatened by its own feelings that it creates the opposite behavior on the surface. So if someone has suddenly become overly nice to you, overly complimentary, or overly interested in your life after a period of success, be very, very careful. Their shadow might be plotting against you. Jung documented case after case of patients who became excessively generous, kind, and supportive toward people they unconsciously despised. One patient brought expensive gifts to a friend she secretly resented for getting married before her. Another went out of his way to help a colleague he unconsciously hated for getting promoted. The conscious mind creates elaborate performances to hide what the shadow truly feels. According to Carl Jung, most people are unconsciously desperate for psychological control over others. They need to feel needed. They need to feel important in your emotional world. They need to believe that you can't function without their advice, their support, their validation. Jung called this psychological symbiosis, when two people become so enmeshed that one person's growth threatens the other person's sense of identity. In healthy relationships, both people encourage each other's independence. But in unconsciously codependent relationships, your growth becomes their crisis. When you start becoming emotionally independent, when you stop seeking their approval, when you stop sharing every problem with them, when you stop needing their constant validation, when you develop your own opinions and boundaries, something breaks inside them at an unconscious level. Your independence becomes their abandonment. Your strength becomes evidence of their weakness. Your growth becomes proof of their stagnation. And here's the scariest part, they will never admit this to themselves. Instead, their unconscious mind will start finding fault with everything you do. That new confidence you have, they'll call it arrogance. That peace you found, they'll say you've become distant and cold. That boundary you've set, they'll claim you've become selfish. That success you're enjoying, they'll insist you've forgotten where you came from. Carl Jung called this projection, when we take our own uncomfortable feelings and throw them onto someone else like a psychological hot potato. But when it happens to you, it feels like the whole world has gone crazy. You're becoming the best version of yourself, and suddenly everyone seems to have a problem with it. Jung spent years analyzing this pattern in his practice. He found that people who are threatened by others' emotional independence often have deep-seated fears of abandonment that date back to childhood. When you become less dependent on them, it triggers these ancient wounds, and their unconscious mind goes into survival mode. This is perhaps the most dangerous trigger of all, and Jung spent years studying this phenomenon in his practice. He called it the violation of the psychological contract. Every relationship has what psychologists call an unspoken contract, invisible rules about who you're supposed to be, how you're supposed to act, what role you're supposed to play in their life, and what function you're supposed to serve in their psychological ecosystem. Maybe you were always the friend who listened to their problems without sharing your own. Maybe you were the family member who never challenged authority or questioned family dynamics. Maybe you were the colleague who stayed in the background and made others look good. Maybe you were the partner who was always accommodating and never made demands. According to Carl Jung, these contracts aren't consciously negotiated, they develop unconsciously over time, and both parties begin to depend on them for psychological stability. But what happens when you break that contract? What happens when you stop playing the role they've assigned you? What happens when you start expressing opinions they don't like, or pursuing goals they don't understand, or developing parts of your personality that don't fit their image of who you should be? Their unconscious mind goes into panic mode. According to Carl Jung, this creates what he called psychological displacement. They feel like they're losing control of their world, and they blame you for the chaos. You're not just changing, you're threatening the entire structure of their psychological reality. Jung found that people often prefer predictable dysfunction to unpredictable growth. They would rather have you stay in a role that limits you than risk the uncertainty of you becoming someone they can't control or predict. Carl Jung discovered that one of the fastest ways to make someone secretly hate you is to reflect back to them parts of themselves they don't want to see. This happens more often than you might think, and it's almost always unconscious. When you start living authentically, setting boundaries, speaking your truth, or refusing to participate in toxic dynamics, you become a mirror that shows others their own compromises, their own lack of authenticity, their own failure to stand up for themselves. Jung called this shadow confrontation, and he found it to be one of the most threatening experiences for the human psyche. When someone sees in you the courage they lack, the boundaries they should set, the authenticity they've abandoned, or the self-respect they've never developed, it creates what Jung called psychological envy. A deep resentment towards someone who embodies what they wish they could be but are too afraid to become. This is why people often become hostile toward others who quit drinking when they know they should, who leave toxic relationships when they're stuck in their own, who pursue their dreams when they've given up on theirs, or who set boundaries when they've never learned how. Your growth becomes evidence of their stagnation. Your courage becomes proof of their cowardice. Your authenticity becomes a spotlight on their pretenses. And instead of using you as inspiration, their unconscious mind chooses to use you as a target. Jung documented countless cases of patients who became irrationally angry at friends or family members who had made positive changes in their lives. The conscious mind creates elaborate reasons why the other person's changes are wrong, dangerous, or selfish. But the unconscious truth is simpler. Seeing someone else's growth forces them to confront their own limitations. According to Carl Jung, relationships have psychological seasons, and most people are unconsciously terrified of autumn. They want every relationship to remain in permanent spring, even when the natural growth cycle demands change. When you outgrow someone, when your interests evolve, when your values shift, when your priorities change, when your conversation needs become more sophisticated, something profound happens in their unconscious mind. They don't just feel left behind, they feel betrayed. Jung called this developmental betrayal, the unconscious belief that growing beyond someone is an act of abandonment or superiority. Even though growth is natural and healthy, the person being outgrown often experiences it as a personal attack. Here's what makes this particularly painful: they'll often try to pull you back to their level rather than rise to meet you at yours. They'll reminisce about the good old days when you were different. They'll make jokes about your new interests or values. They'll try to engage you in old patterns of interaction that no longer serve you. And when you don't respond the way you used to, when you don't laugh at the same jokes, when you don't get excited about the same things, when you don't engage in the same types of conversations, they'll start to resent you for changing or thinking you're too good for them now. Jung found that this dynamic is especially common in families and long-term friendships. People become attached not just to you, but to the version of you that makes them feel comfortable about themselves. When you evolve beyond that version, they experience it as a loss, and loss often turns into anger. Carl Jung discovered that many relationships are built on what he called mutual shadow agreements. Unconscious pacts where people enable each other's dysfunctions, validate each other's excuses, and participate in each other's psychological avoidance. Maybe you used to listen to their complaints without challenging them to take action. Maybe you used to agree with their victim stories without pointing out their role in creating their problems. Maybe you used to participate in gossip, drama, or negative thinking patterns that made you both feel temporarily connected but ultimately drained. According to Jung, these shadow agreements create a false sense of intimacy and understanding. People feel close because they're sharing their darkness, but they're not actually helping each other grow or heal. But what happens when you stop participating in these agreements? What happens when you refuse to enable their complaining, their drama, their victim mentality, or their self-destructive patterns? What happens when you start responding to their problems with solutions instead of sympathy, with challenges instead of validation? Their unconscious mind interprets this as abandonment and betrayal. You're not just refusing to enable them, you're exposing the dysfunction they've been hiding from themselves. You're holding up a mirror that shows them how they've been contributing to their own problems. Jung found that people often prefer relationships that keep them stuck but feel supportive over relationships that challenge them to grow. When you stop being part of their psychological comfort zone, they'll often choose to make you the enemy rather than examine their own patterns. This might be the most disturbing trigger of all, and it's something Carl Jung observed repeatedly in his clinical practice. Some people cannot tolerate others' genuine happiness. Jung called this happiness intolerance, and he found it to be more common than most people want to believe. When you find genuine contentment, inner peace, or authentic joy, it threatens people who are living in quiet desperation, chronic dissatisfaction, or emotional numbness. Your happiness becomes evidence of their misery. Your peace becomes proof of their chaos. Your joy becomes a spotlight on their emptiness. And instead of being inspired by your well-being, their unconscious mind chooses to be threatened by it. According to Jung, people who are genuinely miserable often surround themselves with others who are also struggling because it makes them feel normal. When someone in their circle breaks free from that collective misery and finds genuine happiness, it disrupts the entire system. They'll start questioning your happiness. What are you so happy about? They'll minimize your joy. Just wait, something bad will happen. They'll try to bring you back down. Remember when you were going through that hard time? They'll even create drama or problems to disturb your peace. Jung discovered that misery loves company not just because it wants support, but because it needs validation that happiness is impossible. When you prove that happiness is possible, some people will unconsciously